Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
At my cousin Emily's wedding, right after the first dance, my mom leaned in and said, louder than she thought, "She'll never get married if she keeps gaining weight like that." I said nothing. I smiled like I always do. I was trained to. But then my dad stood up, raised his glass, and said, "Funny, her fiancé just texted me about the ring." My mom's wine froze halfway to her mouth. Her face turned white, and I saw something crack in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. That was the moment everything changed. That was the beginning of the reckoning. I always knew weddings brought out the worst in people, but I didn't expect my mother to choose the exact moment the newlyweds were cutting their cake to take a verbal dump on someone's body. Then again, maybe I should have. It's the kind of thing Diane does with that sweet, cold smile of hers, the kind that makes it look like she's complimenting you while she's taking a piece out of your soul. We were seated at the family table, which felt like being on display at a dysfunctional museum. Everyone in fake pearls and borrowed sentiment. My cousin Emily looked stunning. Her dress wasn't tight, it wasn't clingy, it wasn't anything you could call risky. But Mom still leaned in with a full glass of Chardonnay in her perfectly manicured hand and said just loud enough to be heard over the violin quartet, "She'll never stay married if she keeps gaining weight like that." I didn't say anything. I smiled. That's what I always do. I smiled like a hostage holding up a newspaper. You'd think I'd be used to it by now. Growing up with Diane as a mother meant I'd heard it all. "Are you really going to wear that? You were so much cuter when you were 10. Men love confidence, but not arrogance, sweetie." Her words always rode that thin edge between advice and insult. And somewhere around high school, I learned it was easier to just play dead. Emotionally, I mean. Nod, agree, redirect. Don't confront her. Don't embarrass her. Don't make a scene. We were halfway through the chicken course when it happened. The comment, the dig, the poison, gift wrapped. And the worst part? Emily wasn't even near us. She didn't hear it. But I did. My father did too. He was sitting on the other side of Mom, nursing his third whiskey. Mark, the quiet veteran who never raised his voice unless a car alarm was going off outside his bedroom window. And then, right after she said it, without even blinking, my dad stood up, slowly, casually, glass in hand, cleared his throat. "Funny," he said, his voice steady and loud enough for our side of the tent to hear. "Emily's fiancé just texted me about the ring." You could feel the air change. You know when you're in a church and someone drops the communion tray? That gasp of, "oh no," that fills the room before silence sucks all the oxygen out? That's what happened at that table. My mom's face turned, pale as frosting. Her hand froze midair, wineglass tilting slightly. Her lips moved but no sound came out. I blinked. Once, twice. I had no idea what he meant. Neither did she, I think. But it didn't matter, because the look on her face said it all. She was scared. And that scared me. Because if Diane Whitmore was scared, that meant something real had just happened. I wanted to ask my dad what he meant. But he sat down like nothing was unusual, took another sip and said, "Nice flowers, huh?" With that kind of shit-eating grin you only wear when you've been holding something in for 20 years and finally let a little of it out. Emily was still cutting the cake. Her husband, Matt, a bland but sweet guy who sold medical equipment and had the personality of a warm sock, was smiling wide, completely unaware of the storm gathering 10 feet from him. And I sat there in the middle, between my mother who just said something awful and got punched back with mystery, and my father who never talked and just detonated a family secret without blinking. And me, the emotional Switzerland of this twisted little family unit, sat paralyzed. Fork halfway to my mouth, chicken gone cold, mind running. Because what the hell did he mean? Was he bluffing? Was he just sick of her cruelty? Or did he know something? And if he did, was it worse than the weight comment? I could feel my mother's fury trying to find shape in her throat. But she didn't say a word. She just smiled, tight, too tight, like her whole jaw might snap off. Then she laughed, that fake light laugh she uses at country clubs and funerals. Mark, don't be silly, she said. You don't even know how to text. He raised an eyebrow. Don't have to. Voice to text works just fine. The table went quiet again, and I realized something had shifted. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't Dad making a jab. He was telling her something, maybe something she already knew, or had tried to forget. I should have asked questions right then. I should have leaned in and whispered, "What the hell is going on?" But instead, I stayed quiet, like always, because old habits die harder than marriages. After dinner, when the dancing started and people began to loosen up, I tried to pull my father aside, but he avoided me. Not obviously, but just enough. Talking to Uncle Frank, getting another drink, slipping off to the bathroom. Meanwhile, my mother had switched into full hostess mode, gliding between tables like a politician trying to scrub a scandal off her resume. And in the middle of all that, I started remembering something that didn't make sense until now. 3 weeks earlier, Dad had come over to my apartment alone, said he was running errands, and wanted to say hi. I thought it was weird. He never stopped by without Mom. We sat awkwardly on my couch while I offered him water, and he asked me questions about work, about my landlord, about if I was seeing anyone lately. It was the kind of talk you have when someone's buying time. Now I wondered, had he known something even back then? Had he come to say goodbye without saying goodbye? And then, just before he left that day, he'd said, "Rachel, someday soon, you're going to see things clearer than you want to. Just remember I love you, all right?" At the time, I thought it was about aging, or cancer, or something dramatic and unrelated. But now, sitting under twinkle lights and watching my mother fake smile through another round of conversations, I realized he'd been warning me about her, about this, about whatever was coming. So I got up, I walked to the open bar, I grabbed a vodka soda and downed half of it before turning to look back at the table. My mom was alone now. Dad had disappeared again. And she looked nervous. For the first time in my adult life, Diane Whitmore looked like a woman who'd lost control of the story. And I was just beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to stay silent anymore. Not this time. Not again. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was just how deep this thing would go, because my father's little toast, that was just the first domino. It's funny how a single sentence, 12 harmless little words, can split your life into 2 parts, the before and the after. Emily's fiancé just texted me about the ring. That sentence became a wedge, a crack in the perfectly polished shell of our family's illusion, the kind of illusion that only lasts if nobody breathes too hard near it. And that night, my father didn't just breathe. He exhaled a storm, but the strange part was, nobody said anything after he dropped that line. Nobody screamed. Nobody demanded clarity, not even my mother. She just blinked, tilted her head as if she hadn't heard him correctly, and then went back to dabbing her mouth with her napkin. Like maybe if she kept pretending everything was normal, it would be. But I knew her well enough to recognize the way she clenched her jaw, the white of her knuckles wrapped around her wine glass, like she wanted to crush it in her palm. That wasn't confusion. That was panic dressed in pearls. And my father, calm as ever, didn't offer a single follow-up. He just sipped his drink, sat back in his chair, and watched the chaos bloom around him without lifting a finger. Later that night, after the dancing had slowed and the waitstaff started clearing tables, I finally cornered him behind the tent near the heaters. It was cold out, too cold for the thin chiffon dress I'd worn, but my adrenaline kept me warm enough. I asked him point blank what he meant by the ring comment. He looked at me for a long moment, as if he was deciding whether I was ready to know the truth, and then he said almost offhandedly, "Emily came to me last month. She said she didn't trust Matt." That stopped me in my tracks. Emily? Going to my dad? Not her own parents, not her sister, not even me. Her closest cousin and, I thought, closest confidant, but my quiet, reserved, emotionally elusive father. I didn't understand it. But before I could ask why, he kept going. She said he was acting strange, locked phone, late nights, weird excuses. She thought he was seeing someone. She wanted advice, but she didn't want to confront him without proof. So she asked me to keep an eye out, to help her figure it out. I stared at him, disbelief flooding every inch of me. "And you did? You actually got proof?" He nodded. 2 days ago, he sent me a message by mistake. Must have tapped my name instead of someone else's. I saw enough to know Emily was right. He was meeting someone, a woman, at the hotel, tonight. The hotel, tonight. While Emily was dancing in her dress, while people were clinking glasses and giving toasts, her fiancé, her brand new husband, had been arranging a meetup with someone else. It didn't compute. It felt like fiction, and my father, he just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, like a man who had already mourned this moment and moved on. I asked him the obvious next question. "Did you tell Emily?" He hesitated, just for a second. And in that second, I felt something shift. "Not yet," he said. "I was going to, but I thought, maybe this wedding needs to happen first. For her, for the show, for the family." That made me angry. Not shouting, throwing things kind of angry, but slow, bitter, stomach-hollow angry. The kind that grows inside you like mold in an old house. "So you let her marry him. You stood there and said nothing. You let her go through with it." He looked at me and said something I wasn't prepared for. "Better one betrayal from someone you love than public humiliation in front of 300 people. That's not a lesson you'll understand until you're older." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask why he thought silence was a kindness, why he always chose passivity dressed up as peace. But then I thought about my mother, how she trained us all to smile through discomfort, to hide cracks behind fine china and crisp tablecloths. And I realized something brutal. My father wasn't breaking the cycle. He was just applying his own version of it. He wasn't loud like her, but his silence had done just as much damage. Before I could press him further, he walked off, back into the tent, back into the fake warmth of chandeliers and champagne. I stood there alone, the wind stinging my shoulders, wondering who the woman was. The woman Matt was meeting, the one who wasn't Emily. I didn't get my answer until the next morning, because that night, in the haze of confusion and whispers, I noticed something odd. After the cake was cut, after the garter was tossed and caught by some teenager who looked horrified, my mother disappeared for about 20 minutes, said she needed air. No one questioned it. But I noticed. I noticed because my dad followed her out, waited 5 minutes, and then came back in alone. And she didn't. She returned later with her lipstick reapplied and a different expression on her face, tight, unreadable, like someone who had buried something quickly and hoped it wouldn't be found. That's when it hit me. What if the woman at the hotel wasn't a stranger? What if the person Matt was meeting, the one my father was referencing in that toast, was my own mother? It felt insane, impossible, but the timelines fit. The expressions fit. The silence fit. And when I looked at her across the room, watching her try too hard to laugh, touching people on the arm, brushing hair from her face that wasn't in the way, I didn't see a woman concerned about Emily. I saw a woman terrified of what might leak if someone turned over the wrong rock. So I waited. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask. I went back to my table and watched her closely, the way a hunter watches for movement in the grass. And for the first time in my life, I started thinking about revenge. Not the loud, messy kind, but the slow kind, the quiet kind, the kind that starts with information and ends with reckoning. Because if the truth was what I feared, then my mother hadn't just insulted Emily. She'd betrayed her, and that, even by Diane's standards, was unforgivable. You can live your whole life believing you know someone, believing that even with all their flaws and sharp edges, there's a core to them you understand, a center of gravity that never shifts, no matter how chaotic the rest gets. And then one day, one sentence, one moment, reveals a layer you never even knew existed. That's what it felt like standing in the bathroom of the wedding venue, holding my phone, staring at the text my dad had forwarded me in the middle of the night like it was some kind of forgotten landmine. I don't know if he meant to send it right then, or if he was just done carrying the weight of secrets he'd swallowed for years. But the message was clear, and it wasn't from Emily's now husband, Matt. It was to him, from Matt, short, brutal, and completely undeniable. Room 412, bring wine. She said pearls. That was it, just that. No name, no emoji, no signature. But context is everything, and what I had now was a hammer to the glass case. I'd been staring through my entire life. My fingers shook. My mouth went dry. Because I didn't need a PhD in espionage to figure out who she was. Pearls. Not a lot of women our age wear them anymore. Not unless they've got a closet full of tailored blouses and well-rehearsed condescension. My mother, Diane, the same woman who, 5 hours earlier, whispered about Emily's weight with the cruelty of someone trying to bury her own shame under someone else's skin. I should have been shocked. I should have screamed, or cried, or at the very least denied it. But all I felt was stillness, like my body had gone into emotional lockdown, knowing if it moved too fast, everything would collapse. I stared at the screen until the text burned itself into my brain, then locked the phone and looked up at myself in the mirror. I looked tired, not just physically, but in that deep, cellular way that comes from years of being the one who absorbs, accommodates, adjusts. My whole life had been lived in the shadow of that woman's standards, her judgment, her manipulation, her thinly veiled insults. And now, suddenly, I realized I didn't owe her silence anymore. It wasn't just betrayal, it was patterned behavior. This wasn't about Matt, not really. It was about a woman who had spent her entire adult life controlling the narrative, slicing up her daughter's self-esteem one well-meaning comment at a time, training me like a dog to sit down, stay quiet, look nice. And all that time, she was the one with the secrets, with the stain she thought no one would see if she just kept scrubbing other people harder. I came out of the bathroom into the cool hallway, just as the music shifted to something slow and romantic. The newlyweds were doing their first dance, their bodies moving in a loop of naive celebration, and I watched from the edge, separate, removed, like a ghost haunting a family that didn't know it was already broken. And then I saw her, my mother, standing beside my father, pretending to be delighted, clapping along with the beat, the image of composure. And he, my father, the man I'd always thought was just a background character in our domestic drama, was watching her with a look I hadn't seen before. Not hatred, not even anger, just recognition. As if he, too, had finally named the thing he'd been afraid to name. I didn't speak to either of them that night. I stayed in the background, smiling when people looked, drinking when they didn't, and watching every movement with the kind of hyper-awareness that only comes when something big is coming. Because I knew what I had to do now. The truth was a weapon, but timing was everything. If I used it too soon, it would burn me too. But if I waited, just a little longer, I could make sure every piece of this twisted puzzle fell exactly where it belonged. That night, when I got home, I didn't sleep. I laid in bed with the lights off, going over every word my mother had ever said to me that now sounded different. A man doesn't want a project. You only get one first impression, and if it's wrong, it sticks. Some girls just aren't meant to be wives. All of it had been her talking to herself, projecting her fears, her failures, her mess onto me, dressing it up as advice, and I'd eaten it, believed it, shaped myself around it like wire around a spine, thinking that maybe, just maybe, if I was perfect enough, she'd finally love me the way she performed loving me in front of other people. But now I knew. There was no perfection that could satisfy a woman at war with herself, and that war was no longer mine to fight. I spent the next day gathering what I needed. Not just the message, which I screenshotted and emailed to myself from 5 accounts, just in case, but context, dates, times, her little disappearances. The wine stain on her hotel sleeve she pretended not to notice. I asked Emily casual questions, and though she didn't know the truth, she confirmed enough to make me sure. My mother hadn't just slept with her daughter's fiancé. She'd done it more than once. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. And worst of all, it had happened before the wedding, before the vows, before the cake. The ring wasn't for Emily. Matt had bought that diamond for a woman who used judgment like perfume. My mother didn't care about Emily's weight. She cared that Emily represented something she'd lost: youth, promise, romance that hadn't curdled yet. And she tried to steal it back the only way she knew how, by destroying it. Quietly, intimately, behind closed doors. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. I had a plan. And the next time I opened my mouth, it wasn't going to be in silence. It was going to be with fire. There are moments in life when you realize that the only thing more dangerous than a secret is the silence that surrounds it. Because silence has a way of making rot feel like structure. It becomes part of the foundation until you don't know where the cracks begin. Only that everything around you starts to wobble. I had spent my entire life being complicit in my mother's curated version of the truth, biting my tongue so often it should have been scarred, letting her cast shadows on other people's lives just to keep hers looking clean. But now I held something heavier than anger. I held clarity. And once you've seen things clearly, there's no unseeing, no retreating into the comfort of pretending not to notice. You either act or you let it destroy you slowly. I had never planned to say anything that night. Not really. I'd told myself I'd wait, that the best revenge would come later, when it could be quieter, cleaner, harder to trace back to me. But there's something about watching a woman dance with the man who betrayed her, watching her believe, watching her smile, watching the last shreds of her innocence curl up like burning paper, that snapped something clean in half inside me. Emily had spent the whole evening looking like the human embodiment of hope, and my mother had spent it sipping champagne and laughing like she hadn't slept with that same hope's husband a few days before. That's when I realized the truth didn't need to wait. It needed to be served. So I stood up. No one noticed at first. The DJ had just switched to a slow song, one of those cliché love ballads that weddings always use when people start to fade, when the older guests have left and the younger ones are too drunk to care. I took a fork and tapped my glass, just once. The sound was sharper than I expected, louder somehow, like the universe had cleared its throat. People turned. First a few, then a few more. Eventually, most of the tent had quieted. I saw Emily's face brighten with confusion, then something like gratitude. She probably thought I was giving a last-minute toast to her happiness. My mother, on the other hand, turned to stone. She froze with her napkin in her lap, her smile already evaporating at the edges. And my father, God, my father, he didn't look at me at all. He just took another sip of his drink and stared straight ahead, like a man watching a storm he'd already seen coming. I didn't raise my glass right away. I just stood there, steady, my heart pounding like it was trying to break out of my ribs. And I said, I wasn't planning to say anything tonight. I really wasn't. But there's a kind of pressure that builds up when you spend too much time swallowing things that don't sit right. Eventually, you either choke on it or spit it out. There was a light ripple of laughter, unsure and polite, the kind you hear when people don't know if you're joking or just starting to lose it. I smiled, just enough to keep the room uncertain. Weddings are a beautiful illusion, aren't they? All white dresses and glittering rings and whispered promises. But the thing no one tells you about illusions is how fragile they are. Just one tiny truth and the whole thing can collapse. Poof, gone just like that. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother shift, crossing her legs too quickly, gripping her wine glass with too much tension. Emily was watching me now, blinking like she was trying to figure out what page she was on. Matt had stepped back slightly behind her, his hands in his pockets. He already looked guilty. That part was almost a relief. I raised my glass finally, holding it up like it was a blade. So here's to the people who tell the truth, eventually. Here's to the ones who stop pretending long enough to see the damage they've caused. And here's to brides who don't know yet that they deserved more. And to women who spent their lives thinking being cruel was the same as being strong. I let it hang there. No names, no direct accusations. But everyone who needed to hear it heard it. The silence that followed wasn't stunned, it was loaded. My mother's jaw was tight enough to snap. My father looked down at his plate like it had started to interest him for the first time in years. And Emily, God love her, just tilted her head, looking not hurt, but confused, like she was on the edge of realizing something but wasn't quite sure what it was yet. I ended the toast with one final line, my voice clear and sharp enough to cut. To the real bride in the room, you know who you are. I sat down, no applause, no laughter, just that thick electric silence that tells you you've said something that can't be taken back. My mother didn't say a word. She stood slowly, gracefully, like a queen with a crown made of rusted nails, and left the tent. Not dramatically, not with a scream or a slap, just left. But her absence was louder than anything I could have shouted. Emily stayed seated, her fingers laced together in her lap, her eyes focused on nothing. Matt tried to touch her shoulder, but she didn't react, and I watched the whole thing like I'd just pressed play on a grenade. Later, after most of the guests had trickled out, I stepped outside into the cool night air, my heels clicking on the stone patio, and Emily followed me. She didn't say anything for a long time. We just stood there, two women raised in a family that taught us how to survive, but never how to speak. Then she asked very softly, "You didn't say the worst part, did you?" And I said without turning, "Not yet," because the ring wasn't for her. And I still had one final move left to make. The morning after the wedding was the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, the kind of silence that felt like aftermath, like something had broken in the night, and now the pieces were waiting to be found, sharp and unforgiving. The house was still, except for the occasional sound of birds outside, and the low hum of the refrigerator, and for the first time in years, I heard everything. The creak of the hallway floorboards, the rustle of fabric as I slipped on my jacket, the sound of my own breath. It's incredible what you start to notice when the noise of denial is gone, when the story you've told yourself your whole life has finally been torn down, and all that's left is the wreckage of what actually happened. I didn't tell Emily the full truth that night, not because I was protecting my mother, but because even I understood that some truths, if delivered all at once, don't heal, they shatter. And Emily didn't deserve another fracture, not then. But I knew I couldn't keep carrying this weight, and I knew exactly where it had to go, so I drove. Not in a rage, not with the music blasting, not even crying. I drove like a woman who had made up her mind, with purpose, with finality. I parked outside my parents' house and walked up the front steps without hesitating, knowing full well that once I opened the door, I wouldn't be the same again. That whatever part of me had still belonged to that version of our family was about to die a necessary death. The door was unlocked, as always. That was her way of pretending everything was safe, everything was good. My mother was in the kitchen, making tea. Not coffee, never coffee. Too bitter, too strong. Tea was delicate, polite, controlled. She looked up when I came in and gave me the exact kind of smile I had always hated. Small, tight, perfectly measured. "Well," she said as if I were walking in from a short jog instead of a psychological war, "I suppose you're here to scold me." And for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. "No," I said, dropping my bag on the counter. "I'm here to bury you, with your own words." She laughed, short, dry, the kind of laugh that was meant to dismiss, to deflect, to delay. But I didn't let it land. "You slept with him," I said, flat and cold. "With Matt, Emily's fiancé, before the wedding, more than once." The color drained from her face so fast it looked like someone had unplugged her. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. And I knew then, completely, that it was true. She didn't even try to lie. She just walked slowly to the table and sat down, as if her knees had given out under the weight of the truth. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she said eventually, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I didn't go looking for it. He found me. We were talking at the hotel bar. It just happened." I almost laughed at that. The idea that someone could just happen into an affair, like slipping on a wet floor and falling into bed with your niece's fiancé. But instead I said, "You know what really happened? You saw someone younger, someone who looked at you like you still mattered, and you grabbed it like a lifeline. You didn't care who it hurt. You just didn't want to feel invisible." Her eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. She was too practiced for that, too disciplined. Instead, she said something I wasn't expecting. "I hated myself the whole time." And I said, "Good, but that doesn't make you less of a coward. It just makes you a coward with a conscience." She didn't argue, and that was almost worse than if she had. My father came in a few minutes later, slow and quiet, like he already knew this conversation had found its final gear. He didn't look at me. He just sat down across from her, and for a moment they both looked so small. Two people who had built a life out of pretending, now sitting in the wreckage of what pretending finally costs. "You knew," I said to him, "didn't you, before the wedding?" He nodded once, no excuses, no defenses, just an exhausted truth. "She told me," he said, "about a week before. She said it was over, that she regretted it, that she didn't know why she'd done it." I didn't believe her, but I also didn't want to blow up Emily's life. I stared at him, at the man who used to carry me on his shoulders through amusement parks, who taught me to ride a bike, who made pancakes shaped like animals when I was sick. And I said the thing I had never said to either of them. "You both should have protected her." Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just stood, picked up my bag, and said, "You don't get to be the center of this family anymore, either of you." And I walked out. No slamming doors, no final slurs, just silence, the kind that finally felt like peace. But as I got into my car and looked back at that house, my childhood home, the stage for 1,000 little emotional betrayals, I realized something that shook me to my core. The woman Matt had texted, the one in pearls, it hadn't been my mother. The name on the hotel reservation was someone else. The woman who had met him that night wore pearls, yes, but it was his ex-girlfriend. My dad had found the text, twisted the truth, and used it to drop a bomb at the wedding, not to expose my mother's affair, but to force her to confront it. He'd invented the connection, and now I was left with a choice. Tell Emily everything and destroy her marriage for a mistake that may or may not have ended, or leave it. Let her figure it out herself. Let her live in that space where suspicion grows on its own. I haven't decided yet. Some truths serve justice. Others just serve pain. But I do know this, silence has a weight. And I've carried it for too long. Maybe it's not about telling everything. Maybe it's about choosing what finally deserves to be said. And maybe the heaviest thing you can do is finally put something down and walk away.